Hello, Meoni here, and welcome back to another video. Today I want to talk about the developer panel that happened at FanFest London 2023. I'm a little bit under the weather, but I wanted to put this video out whilst it was still in my mind, because quite honestly it was one of the most impressive panels I've ever been witness to at one of these events or watched online. It was fantastic, and you're going to love the stuff within this if you haven't seen it. So essentially this summary includes information from the both sections of the dev panel, looking at all of the improvements coming in the graphical update for both the environment and to our player characters. First of all, they have Tatsuya Okihisa, the lead technical artist, on stage with Yoshi P, and he listens to the graphic artist then, that's mainly his job, and helps them make systems to make their ideas a reality. For example, when Red Mage casts a spell, when the Focus Crystal and Rapier come together, that kind of thing. This was where his role came in, to devise a way to make that happen without bugs and to make that as fluid as possible. He's also worked on, as you can see in this image, all of the actions, emotions, swimming of your character, gear, graphics, and a lot more. It usually works like this, he says. The artist sends a art document, and then he would try to make this a reality in the game, with the fiery ring floating behind the character here as an example from the Pandemonium raid. Making it properly appear in the game is a process of the team making the spell effect and then trying to make it look right in the game in many different situations. In this case, he wanted to make sure that no matter what mount you went into, the spell effect from this gear didn't look strange. As you can see on an early look with the Omega mount here, the ring would be floating outside of the mount in its flight mode, because the player character is put inside of the mount when you go into flight. With the magic bed mount, again it looked okay in one form, but then the realization was given that when you took to the air you'd see the ring underneath your character clipping through the bed at the bottom. This is not all. The challenges with gear sets, as you can see here, also includes things like status effect issues. When you gain the minimum effect debuff from a raid on your character, you shrink, but the fire ring particle effect did not actually change size. There are so many things that can be done in the game, from emotes, places, locations, actions. They all have to try and make these work together with whatever the set is that they design. As you can see, this is just a few examples of a gear not appearing how they want to with various mounts. Essentially, they devised a way to make this spell effect turn off and on depending on the mount or situation. This basic example here lists a spreadsheet that shows you values on or off, essentially, acting as a reference for the programmers to implement this data into the game. This is just one example of one of these hurdles that the technical artist has to overcome, and really kind of paints home what they do. They also do memory tests to ensure the load provided by an effect or a spell or situation is not heavily impacting the game, so they load a dev room to test the effects being shown on over 100 characters at the same time. This helps to troubleshoot the load issues and ensures a layer of quality assurance, even at this stage. So to further explain what a technical artist actually does in the industry, which is a fairly new sort of position in the games industry, this chart shows you the overlap of responsibilities, allowing them to both do some art as well as some coding at the same time. This helps bridge the gap, crossing responsibilities, and the departments work safely and more efficiently together, more than if they were to be without one. That's basically how much of a game changer this is. He describes his role akin to a buff that a developer gains from the technical artist by bringing out the full potential of their work, making things easier and the workflow simpler. The character gear demonstrated here shows the design specifications that they create assets based on this. With the varying body sizes, a lot of bandwidth is taken in the game to accommodate every difference in scaling between those races, so everything is addressed one by one per race to ensure quality. However, they do try to automate this as much as possible and use some basic morphing between race sizes. Then the team goes in and polishes everything and makes it look as best as they can, obviously, but a lot of that time is taken out by their automotive technology that they're employing here, which should give the artists more time to spend on their creative work as much as possible. Let's move on to the graphical update then in 7.0. They show the key aims of this update include emphasis on enhancing screen-wide aesthetic appeal, texture and shadow resolutions, improving material qualities, and preserving the existing game style, revealing that they have been making over 100 updates, both big and small so far. They didn't want to go over all 100 changes because they wouldn't fit into this panel, but they do show a few, mostly here for characters. Firstly then, looking at face changes, they show a male Elezen before and then afterwards. The texture of the skin, the texture of the gear, the ears, the eyes here, hair, all of this has had a polygon count increase as well as additional updates to the shader tech. This is a shot of the normal map of textures on a face then for this Elezen. The current shader in the game bounces colour that's on the surface of each polygon. The new shader, coming with new subsurface scattering tech, not only is the colour of the polygon reflection, but also light goes below the surface of the skin of the character and sort of gives it a realistic translucent effect like real skin, allowing for light to pass a certain amount of transparency through it. So this is a before with normal mapping, and then after with this subsurface scattering shader turned on. In this particular image it's fairly subtle, but it does add further realism to the skin, and you could really see those textures have improved. A better shot of this is with this comparison, where you can see the light actually passing through the edges of the skin, sort of like through the cartilage of the ear. It's a much better way of seeing the effect in action, and honestly, considering this is going to be affected by time of day, it's going to be really interesting, especially if you see spell effects and things like that. G-pose is going to be amazing in 7.0. Additionally, they show a Lalafell here with this change in mind. The details on the ear is definitely more noticeable. They mention how with this design, they wanted Lalafells to be less realistic and more focused towards a doll-like appearance, as per their design instructions. With Rogadin here, it's enhancing that ruggedness and their rough face texture, sort of bringing out all of those contours and all of that hair. And the maps have been completely remade for all of the character races in the game. Over 300 maps have been updated thus far, and one of the most impressive ones is Hrothgar with their fur. They really up the quality of the face with a brand new fur shader that they're implementing across the board. This fur shader will be applied both to Hrothgar, obviously, and any character or future races like maybe female Hrothgar, as well as mounts as well. So like, for example, a tiger with that fur effect applied to it, it'll look completely different. So they're applying this across the board. A lot of stuff will be backdated over time. Next, they look at eyes, first with a higher in the current game, and now with the update. They reviewed the calculations for the highlights then in all of the eyes in the game. Previously, they had the highlight actually drawn into the iris, so it didn't move. But with the graphic update, they wanted to move on from this and have a dynamic and more natural looking highlight in the eye. They also added a refraction formula to add even more realism, again similar to the subsurface scattering. In this video clip, you can see the highlight changing depending on the time of day in the game, so the position of the highlight is changing dynamically wherever you are or whatever time it is in the game. Next, the aura limbal rings are being switched from just polygons that are drawn on to a brand new shader calculation. This means instead of angled textures that are just drawn on there, they can make it look much more like a realistic eye. Also worth mentioning here is how incredible those new horn and scale textures look. I know they talked about that in the the keynote, but you could really see it a lot better on this image. Onto the hair changes then. This is a Mikote before and now after. So the new texture updates make it look much more smooth. There's a lot more defined lines on here. The hair maps have much higher resolution and as a result have better highlights from lighting. A higher female here then in this example with the update. On this video clip, they show how they define where each piece of hair will actually flow, which direction the light would hit it. By doing this, they can actually simulate a basic physics with the hair, so physics-based hair simulations. Not only does hair look better in 7.0, it will also now have improved physics calculations, so it moves better as well. This allows light to hit each section properly, no matter where you are or what time it is. As you can see further in this clip, you can see the highlight moving across the hair in those different parts and those different directions depending on where the light source is. This also means that the new shadows are being cast in different directions from the parts of the hair itself, which adds more depth to your character's face and obviously looks 10 times more realistic. Moving on to gear then, as you can see the regular shaders on the left there, and the images on the right show the new shaders with the update. They lifted the upper restrictions on memory usage for Dawntrail, and now they can pre-calculate reflections on gear, raising the resolution of the reflections or adding colour if they want to. So if you're in an area such as Ifrit with all of that fire, it will be reflected onto the gear as well with a lot of red coloration. They will be implementing in this update a new physics-based rendering system, or PBR, if you're familiar with that. This is an example of nighttime lighting on these textures then. This helps further illustrate the differences to stock. The sky is very dark and is actually being reflected off of the surface here with all of the colours of the stars, and is much more accurate to what we would imagine it to look like. With 14, they say they're not pursuing photorealism per se, so the physics-based rendering is being used more of a tool to make things look more cool looking. So sometimes they actually go beyond real-life physics or much further below it to keep that fantasy vibe. So they don't just use the calculations as they come stock, they tailor it to their own vision, which is really cool to hear about. This is a before of the Paladin artifact gear, and here is an after. This then is showing reflections from the ground, the sky, everything around here, the paths. The highlighting is much more natural looking. They also show us this in two other locations, before in the Gold Saucer and Amarang, and then side by side with the new updates in those same locations. Look at all the reflections of the Gold Saucer there, all that gold being reflected off of the metal, making it actually look like real metal and chrome. Honestly, it's ridiculously pretty. Environments are going to be impacted very heavily on your gear now, and I'm really excited for this one. Here is the texture maps then, and the updates that they have done. As an example, both are before and after for the Paladin gear here. As you can see, it's a massive improvement. There's a lot more detail being packed in there. They say till now they had to work around strict memory restrictions, but now that they have more capacity, they can update data structures of various texture maps. This also means that now you can depict much more weathering and actual damage to armor, and allows the team to really experiment with new ways to show gear and its aging. This image shows the variation of physics-based rendering on materials and the textures applied to them on the metal. You can adjust these parameters to give the effect of many different types of textures, from rough metal, brushed steel, polished, or even damaged or rusted metals. Here's an example of stone, plastics, and woods, which are all being updated in very much the same way, allowing for seriously advanced ways to design items and indeed locations. Here's an example for cloth calculations as well, from making things look more like PVC or leather, satin, velvet, silks. This is going to make gear really pop with diverse sections made with all of these different materials, which is much easier seen if you look at the new artifact gear for the Viper job added in Dawntrail in this picture. You can really see the difference between that leather and the cloth, and also the bits of metal as well on the shoulders. They then show glass. It's now capable of refracting light, even with the distortion of images present in those reflections, so that's going to be applied to any glass texture. More texture of gear here, and as you can see with the Scholar outfit, the cloth texture is much more improved from its original state, looking almost like leather and real felt, and again with the glass parts with the file on the hip there, and the monocle glasses that got attention with that new glass tech that refract light in a new way. Now we move on to creatures, and here's a before and after. The textures have been massively improved and the resolution is much higher than it's ever been before. They're using the shaders talked about earlier here as well to change the appearance of light and reflections on the skin. They stress how the polygon count for this has not actually improved. This is just a higher resolution texture, and of course the lighting effects, which is just mind-blowing if you think about it. The skin looks more slimy and reflective, meaning that if you can imagine all sorts of monsters, they'll start to even look more grotesque and wonderful depending on the setting. I can't wait to see some of the raid bosses personally. This video clip talks about how they have taken the races in the game and across the board standardized the amount of polygons they all use. Up until now, they had much separate data for every different race with varying numbers, but now it's all going to be standardized, and it really helps with development because they have the same values to play with. They are also able to repurpose this data that they have to be more efficient when making new assets, making the whole process a lot more streamlined. This section is wrapped up with this image of a new alpaca mount coming in Dawntrail. This is both showing off the new fur shader, which will be applied to mounts, which is absolutely fantastic, I think you'll agree, and obviously an excuse to show us a new mount, which also looks awesome. Who doesn't love an alpaca? Then we switch to the next part of the panel with the background artist Masato Shida, who is responsible for reviewing background visuals to ensure quality, environmental design, as well as brushing up the game's textures. Masato Shida worked on the environment textures for these areas in the background of this video as an example. Limsa Lominsa as a main example was inspired from Dover in the UK as well as Eastbourne in the UK. The white walls that you can see in the city and coastal areas are a reflection of what Masato-san actually saw in real life. Photos are actually taken all around the world and then used in the game. When visiting Finland, for example, Masato-san took this picture of the actual ground below him. He then goes into Photoshop and removes the feet from the photo as an example of anything they don't want in the picture they can remove. And then the image is made into a perfect square shape. They then begin to tile those together to make a much bigger image. They then blur the transition between these images and make them blend together perfectly. They continue to modify the image and make it blend together into a much larger square, a 9x9 as an example here. Then they take this image they're happy with and convert it to a texture they can use in the development of the game as data. And here it is in the game in a dev room making a flat texture. So Finland is actually in the game, and so is any other picture Masato-san actually uses. They then place this texture data on a larger surface data, which obviously has bump mapping and height maps. So Labyrinthos is made up of textures made from a photo of Finland. That's amazing, isn't it? They add paths and other scatter details to blend it further with the textures being mapped with height, and it looks perfect in the game. I would have never have guessed they did it this way. It's fantastic, isn't it? So moving on, another feet pick in Tokyo then when strolling through a park. The same principle is applied here. Into Photoshop, remove the items you don't want, turn it into a texture, place it in the game, add a snow texture, and that's how the cobblestone texture in Ishgard was created. So Tokyo, a random park somewhere, the tiles on the floor were turned into Ishgard's flooring. These are often not just used once either, they actually repurpose these textures from these original photos all the time. For example, the Tokyo image was used as well in Labyrinthos for all of the paths there, with minor changes to the texture applied that normally would be snow, now looks like either moss or dirt, and a slight colour change texture over the top of the tiles themselves, but they are exactly the same asset, so every time you go there you'll notice this. Now we've mentioned it, but it is an amazing amount of magic that I never knew existed. For the background designs then, when a new area is created, they get design documents that give context for the story of the area, but a lot of the time no details are actually given on the specifics of what types of buildings or textures are present. So they come up with their own ideas and make something appropriate to what information they have to make an appropriate depiction of what they imagine these areas would look like. They're given pretty much free rein on this. Artists strive to make something recognizable and believable, and I think that's sort of evident in all of the areas we've seen so far. They do a fantastic job. Specifically in environmental design, Masato Shida works to create the atmosphere as the artists control each area's daily lighting cycle and the appearance of its sky. This is Favnia's sky. They try to create a sky that is appropriate and unique to that area. They create different weather effects and particles as well, like rain. Masato-san mentions how even the clouds in the skies, including in Favnia, are done in the same way as the floor textures. So they take pictures of real-life clouds and cloud formations and weather formations, and then they change them into textures by editing them in Photoshop, which is also quite fascinating. Also, they move the lighting within dungeons to ensure that the correct elements are lit up, and to make the dungeon feel expansive, yet still dark and deep, but highlight the important areas to help players, go through that area and know where to go. With the graphical update then, the backgrounds will be changing, so grass is changing massively as we've seen before in the Las Vegas Fan Fest. All the areas in the game that currently have grass are being applied with this change, so no matter where you go, the game will present the lush plant life and foliage that's demonstrated in this image, which is fascinating. I can't wait to see all of that. Metallic surfaces such as this aetherite here with the crystal in Old Charlian look incredible now, as you can see from this video clip of it rotating. The crystal itself has the new shaders allowing subsurface scattering to bring it to life, as well as the reflection mapping, new shaders, lighting and shadows. Overall, it's very impressive and makes the world much less flat. In Old Charlian, the fog, which they also have worked on, will change from how it is now to this fantastic looking example of a new effects and shaders in action. It looks so impressive. The depth of this adds so that it makes you feel like a true fantasy experience. It makes you feel like you're in a very fog-filled location. You can't see all the way through it. It gives more depth to the area. It looks so thick, and you could kind of almost feel how damp it would be to walk there. The way the light of the sun is being diffused as well through that layer of fog, it's sort of like a soft texture, adding so much more height to the image as well. The same here in this image for Elpis, with the fog offering much softer lighting and making it harder to see further distances, but at the same time illuminating those edges, giving you that sort of idea of what might be there. Another example of the fog weather effect in Ilmeg here kind of looks like the lake is causing the fog, like early morning sort of fog or dew being formed, which is fascinating. Shadows are much improved in Dawntrail, and a good example of this is on buildings. So before, the building in the distance at the top there of Old Charlian looks rather flat, but in the new version, the shadows bring that architecture to life, adding depth and making the building look much bigger than it actually did previously. With interiors, ambient occlusion is being improved and added to the game. It's much easier to show here, but the shadows and depth of dark areas will look more realistic, and all of the items and floor assets will cast their own shadows properly, which will give that depth of being and realism. With the graphical update, they also put in a detail map. So this means when a camera goes close to a wall texture, for example, it will actually show a much higher quality than it previously did. Currently in the game, the walls here of Old Charlian up close are blurry, sort of low quality texture maps. And then in the new update, as you can see, all of that detail has been brought to life. You can almost see the pores of the rock, if that was even a thing. It looks so much better and more realistic. They plan currently to update over 700 textures. They wonder how long this is going to take them, and I don't know if they're going to make this in time for the release, but of course this is something they want to do over time to the entire game, because obviously the results speak for themselves. Here is an image of one of the new zones with the aetherite coming in Dawntrail, demonstrating this tech is being used in all of the new areas. So whilst the old game might take some time to do everything in all of the areas to the same standard, the new areas will be using it from a ground up going forward, so Dawntrail areas will actually give you the best example of what to expect going forward with this development. And that's all for the development panel, a frankly impressive and rather unmissable discussion that I think a lot of people did miss. They mentioned how many of the things were big, but not enough of importance to fit into the keynote itself, which is why the panel was made in the first place. But I think honestly most of this, especially the environments, the shadows and that shader information, the subsurface scattering, and physics-based rendering sections were fascinating to watch and listen to, and will definitely impact the game in such a way that, yeah, it's still going to be the same game, but my goodness, it will be tempting to play through all over again. You'll be feeling like you're walking through a whole new experience. It's going to be really, really, really cool. Anyway, let me know what you're most excited for. Personally, I think the subsurface scattering and PBS are my two favorites to take from this. I cannot wait to see what my character looks like in Dawn Trail, and hopefully, all of the pieces of gear I love have been updated with that release, but we'll have to wait and see. Much love, more videos on the way, and I'll see you all next time. Bye-bye.